welcome to Sense and Sensibility, the Inflation Guy podcast. I am Michael Ashton. I am the Inflation Guy, and I am your host. And where are we? Let's see. So last month, we're about to get the May CPI, but April's CPI, which I don't think I've done a podcast since then, but it came in very strong. It was an increase of 0.4% on median CPI, which put the year-on-year median higher for the first time in a while. But if you read my blog summary, and there's a link in the show notes, of course, all the time to the sort of the most recent CPI summary, you'll know that is just that number is just a payback for the exaggeratedly low figure about 6 months ago on the rental side of things that happened because of the government shutdown and some assumptions the BLS made, and because of the way that the sample rotates. There's sort of this 6 month delay, and so we've kind of known this was coming. So it scared a lot of people, but if you kind of got below the headline, it was still a little bit scary. And but the big jump of 0.4% in median, which we hadn't seen in a while, exaggerates how strong it was. Now we're going to get another number in 2 days, and so but I believe we've sort of seen the lows in median CPI for a while, and it's going to probably trend higher over the balance of this year, especially as we drop off those artificially low numbers from, fourth quarter of last year. The underlying economy is strong. We just got the employment number on Friday showed a gain in non-farm payrolls of 172,000 against expectations for 88, but also with an upward revision of 93,000 to the prior 2 months. So really kind of a massively big number. And we've been having relatively high numbers in employment growth. Now, those aren't high numbers compared to what they were 5 years ago or so. But 5 years ago or so, we needed higher numbers because we had to assimilate all of the new undocumented immigrants that were coming into the country, and so if we didn't have enough job growth, then it led to more unemployment. Because that flow of immigrants has reversed, the actual number that we need to sort of keep the unemployment rate from going up is a much lower number. So when we get 150,000 new jobs or something, now that's more than enough to keep the unemployment rate from going up, and to make sure that people who want a job can find a job for the most part. And so so job growth is strong, and by most measures, the economy as a whole is strong. Wages were a little softer this month. We sort of have to wait until we see the Atlanta wage growth tracker, which was 3.6% last time it came out, which was kind of one of the recent lows, but 3.6% year on year for sort of a median growth in wages is not exactly a low number, and as I've said a bunch of times, that sort of needs to keep on coming down if we want to have if we want core inflation ex shelter, the super core part. If we want super core to keep falling, then we need to have wages continue to decline, and I'm not really sure that's necessarily going to happen. But so the underlying economy, though, is strong, and the question is that bad news for inflation? Are we going to get higher inflation, because of wages or whatever? Because we're going to have the unemployment rate is going to go down if we keep having this kind of strength. And the answer is not per se. Growth, as I've said a million times, doesn't cause inflation. We don't get inflation because we run out of stuff and we have to bid it up, unless we have a lot of money and we can bid those things up. Money does cause inflation, and I'll get back to that in a second. Don't forget that that when different parts of the economy do grow differently, and so you can get changes in relative prices, even if you didn't have overall inflation. So what do I mean by that? If, say, AI, because hyperscalers are building all these new, AI, huge buildings full of computer banks so they can, do all the AI stuff, that tends to bid up the cost of electricity in an area. In fact, one of the really interesting problems going forward for this economy over the next 10 years is going to be that if AI does continue to grow, as the AI stocks imply that AI is going to grow, then we need to figure out where all the electricity is coming from, because we don't have enough electricity for it, which is a totally different question for a totally different podcast and probably a totally different podcaster. But for our purposes, the question is, well, okay, if AI is bidding up the cost of electricity in an area, because suddenly they need many more gigawatts, and so that the local power provider who was providing nice, clean, green energy now has to start burning coal in order to provide all of that energy. So if AI bids up the cost of electricity, it clearly changes the cost of electricity in that area when AI is expanding. It would be foolish to say that supply and demand in any given market don't matter. So I say, growth doesn't cause inflation, but that's not the same as saying supply and demand in a particular market, say the market for electricity in the area of, Dubuque. I have no idea if there's a hyperscaler near Dubuque. I kind of doubt it. But for an example, supply and demand in that market clearly matters for that relative price. But if there isn't enough money in the system, those increases in costs suck up money from other things. And on a microeconomic basis, those other things decline on a relative basis. So if there's not enough, too much money in the system, maybe because your electric bill is too high, you can't spend as much money on milk or underwear or cars. Okay, and so relatively the prices of those things decline because you can't spend as much on them because you have to spend so much on electricity. So we see a relative price change between electricity and underwear, but we don't see the overall price level rise because there's not enough electricity. And so you can be tricked into thinking, oh my gosh, there's inflation because you happen to notice these things. And we are wired to notice the things that go up. You notice the increase in those prices and you say, well, that's real inflation. But you're not offsetting them in your brain with the things that are going down. And so that's why money, even though you can get these supply and demand imbalances, like we did in COVID, the real mistake in COVID was putting lots and lots of money into the system so that, something was more expensive, but you had plenty of money to go and spend on it. So you didn't have to spend less on other things. You could buy guns and butter because there's plenty of money in the system. So you pay more for electricity and you pay more for milk and you pay more for underwear and you pay more for cars. So the bigger concern when it comes to inflation and is inflation going to start rising again here, is the slow acceleration that we're seeing in money supply growth, which reached a 4.7% year on year in April for M2, and quarter on quarter of 6.7%. Both of those are the highest numbers since they were coming down in 2022. And I've said it before, and I'll say it again, prior to COVID, and really prior to the end of sort of globalization and some of the other nice secular tailwinds we had, we were able to grow the money supply at something like 6% without causing inflation because we had these other sort of things working in our favor. And those things are now working against us. So 5% is too high. That is not going to be, we can't get 2% inflation with 2.5% growth and with money growth above, 4.5%, 5%. We're just not going to get there. And so we've seen money supply growth, which had gotten negative for a while, actually gradually accelerating, and now it's getting up close to 5%, and it doesn't look like it's stopping anytime soon. And that's what we have to worry about, not AI, not the hyperscalers. But also the underlying statistics. So getting back to sort of the number that we just saw, and I said the headline was scary, but when you went underneath the headline, there were some underlying concerns suggesting rising cost pressures across a number of different categories. And that probably is because there are upstream pressures like electricity, like diesel fuel because of the war in Iran, which feed into many things. And so you don't just see the rise in the price of electricity, you see, or the rise in the price of diesel fuel and shipping, you see how those prices are now being translated into other things downstream. Now, normally that sort of thing shows up in diffusion indices, where we calculate a diffusion index is basically a way of looking at it kind of in simple terms. Let's take all the stuff that's going up and subtract all the stuff that's going down, and accelerating versus decelerating. You see this a lot of times when you take a survey. The people who think the economy is expanding minus the people who think the economy is shrinking, and so we call this a diffusion index. And there's a couple of different ways to do this. You're calculating the balance between the stuff that's going up and stuff that's going down. And in fact, the Enduring Investments Inflation Diffusion Index just had the highest reading since April of 2023 when it was coming down, which coincided approximately with the peak or near the peak of median CPI. So we had these very high readings, meaning you had many more accelerating categories than decelerating categories. And that coincides with prices going up. And then once that kind of ebbed, then we saw the price increases slow. So the EIIDI, the Enduring Investments Inflation Diffusion Index, has indicated that there's starting to be this kind of broad pressure. But what's interesting is that there are other diffusion indices, and most of the other diffusion indices that you see are saying that this is not really a big problem, that those inflation diffusion indices are not rising. Why is ours different? Well, there's two basic normal ways to build a diffusion index, and one is weights-based. So you add up the weights of everything that is accelerating minus the weights of everything that's decelerating. Now, obviously, when you're just taking a survey, right, this isn't an issue. You count the number of people saying things are going up minus the number of people saying things are going down. But when you're talking about inflation, you have to figure out, well, how am I going to count how much is going up, how much is going down? And one of the ways to do that is by saying weights. Okay, we'll add up the weights of all the categories that are rising minus the weights of all the categories which are decelerating, and that's your diffusion index. The problem with that is that right now, because rents are or have been decelerating, and rents are a very large weight in the CPI, it means that that sort of diffusion index is going to look soft even if most of the items that we buy every day are going up in price because you have a big chunk of it that's decelerating. I keep kind of mixing these terms up. It's really accelerating minus decelerating, not going up versus going down, not inflation versus deflation. And I keep mixing that up. But rents are decelerating, they're not going down. And so even if everything else we are buying is accelerating, it's rising in price faster, that kind of diffusion index is still not going to look terribly alarming because rents are decelerating. So there's another way to do a diffusion index, and that's a count-based diffusion index, which is a lot like counting the number of people who say the economy is doing better versus doing worse. And in that kind of diffusion index, we add up the number of categories accelerating minus the number of categories decelerating, which sounds like it might make a little bit more sense, except that what that does is it gives roughly twice as much weight to food, which has 62 item level series, than it gives to medical care plus transportation combined, which has 11 item level series and 21 item level series respectively. So between them, 32 versus 62 for food. And so in that sort of circumstance, you can have just one category, something like food. If a lot of different food categories, we know that meat is going up a lot, but if other types of food categories are decelerating, then that sort of diffusion index is not going to look very alarming either. So the enduring investments inflation diffusion index kind of treads the middle ground, weighting each item in each major category in such a way that the whole category gets an equal weight, so that each of the 62 categories in food gets 1/62 of the weight, whereas each of the 11 categories in medical care gets 1/11 of the weight. You can kind of think about it as being a count-based index, but with capped weights per category, kind of. So it's kind of a middle ground. And I think that it certainly lands with me more viscerally when I see that number going up. That kind of seems to match my own observations and how I feel looking around at what's happening. Then it seems to match more than the diffusion signals, if diffusion indices that are sending all is well signals. And so maybe it's behavioral, something between, wow, lots of little things are going up in price, so my shopping basket is a lot more expensive, and wow, some big things are going up in price, so my overall expenditure is rising. So maybe it's some combination of that. Maybe it's an illusion for me to think that it feels like there's more inflation out there than these diffusion indices are saying. So I might just be wrong, but I think that the enduring index makes a reasonable, strikes a reasonable balance between these different ways of sort of counting things. In short, it doesn't feel like all is well. And so when these diffusion indices say all is well, I'm a little bit skeptical, except for overall economic growth, which does seem to be doing okay. But let's go back to that economic strength thing. At one point, and I have been one of the people who, for quite some time, has been expecting the recession. We haven't gotten this recession. We got kind of a rotating recession, and but we really haven't gotten a recession. We had a little bit kind of in the last year or so of Biden, but it wasn't terrible, right? And so I always kind of thought we'd get a recession, but it wouldn't be a terrible recession. But I thought that maybe this strength that we've been seeing was illusory. AI companies are spending a lot of money, and the government is spending a lot of money on war fighting, and both of those things show up in GDP, and so it makes the growth numbers look really good. But it's very focused in both cases on those two little sectors. But now that the strength that we were seeing sort of in GDP is showing up in jobs, it's a little hard to kind of dispute, right? I mean, it definitely looks like there's some strength. Part of that increase in jobs is because of hyperscaler building, but also it's partly because of the entrepreneurial explosion due to AI, which is just one of these crazy little things. So Torsten Slok of Apollo has been writing about this for a while, and I think I mentioned this on X a while back. He's been reminding us that there's something called the Jevons paradox, wherein labor-saving innovations don't lead to less employment, but more employment. Because each worker is more productive, you want to employ more of them, even if the unit price of what they produce declines, because they're producing so many more units that it's productive to go and employ more of them. And I mentioned something like this in episode 154 when I was talking about AI, but I wasn't nearly as erudite as to remember that, Stanley Jevons in this context. But Torsten Slok has had several examples, and the one that I love is how online travel booking, when the internet became a big thing, and so you could do online travel booking, and that was supposed to absolutely destroy the travel agent. Why do you need a travel agent? You can go do this yourself. But in fact, the count of the number of travel agents not only has grown, but it's grown faster since that innovation. And again, Torsten has a couple of different examples of this, and it's just really fascinating. The number of accountants, even though you've got QuickBooks, right? The number of Excel was supposed to absolutely destroy lots of jobs, and it obviously has not. So the AI boom isn't killing jobs at all. It's creating them. And a lot of what it's creating are entrepreneurial jobs. And in episode 154, I said I thought that meant that the employment numbers might get undercounted because the birth-death model doesn't account for things like an AI boom. And so it was probably going to undercount the number of entrepreneurial pursuits. But anyway, similarly to the way inflation is diffusing through the economy because you have some things like electricity and diesel fuel, those prices, now diffusing through into the economy, so is growth, right? So the great big boom in AI, which may or may not end up being a boon for those stocks, for the AI stocks in the long run, because they're valued at such a level that it's hard to believe they can ever really deliver on that. Just like many internet stocks in, 99 and that were darlings in 99 and were out of business by 2002, but yet we still have the internet and all those great things. So the AI stocks might not really end up being the huge beneficiaries going forward, but the economy is going to be. So anyway, so just like inflation is diffusing through the economy, growth is doing it as well. And it's a very interesting time and some things to watch going forward. It's just that those two things, the growth and the inflation, are just not directly related. And I want to make I want to make sure that I say that very clearly. The missing link there is the money growth. And as the money growth here is going up, that's what's causing the inflation. It makes them look like they're related, but they're really not. Relative prices, yes, but absolute prices, no. Okay, now I'm 22 minutes in here, and I want to change gears for just a second and ask for your help. Directly ask for your help. People have told me they like the podcast and that it helps them. And now I want to ask your help in a little way. Adam Savage of Mythbusters fame wrote a book several years ago about things he has learned in his life as a maker. And it was called, and it's a very good book. It's called Every Tool's a Hammer, with the subtitle, Life is What You Make It. There's a link in the show notes if you want it. It's a great book. Possibly one of the best things about the book is its title, but it is really a good book and useful, and I think especially useful for young people thinking about how to go forward in life. But if you've ever built anything and you didn't have the right tool handy, you understand his point that every tool's a hammer, right? It is true that to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail, but it's also true that to the man who really needs to pound the nail, everything looks like a hammer. You turn around that screwdriver and whack it with the butt of the screwdriver or your shoe or whatever. And I thought about this recently because I too am a tool maker. Not the tool and die kind of tool maker, but in my career I've invented one iteration of the CPI futures contract. I've invented various structured note forms using inflation derivatives and other sorts of derivatives to deliver really interesting payoff profiles, various investment products, some of which became or almost became ETFs, some of which became or almost became private funds, and of course, most recently, and most poignantly, USDI, the inflation index cryptocurrency that will eventually be sliceable into inflation subcomponents. And I've obviously talked a lot about that on this podcast. But it's a tool, okay? It's a tool that people have never had, though, and so it takes time for people to learn how to use it. This is a story of my life as an inflation guy, is that developing these new methods, people don't always get it at first. And it takes a while and a lot of missionary sales for people to really understand what it is and why this is really cool that we can do these things. And a lot of the stuff that I was, trying to get people to understand in 2003 and was really hard to get people to understand are now really commonplace. And that's what's going to eventually happen to USDI. But I said to my partners recently, I said, it's as if we're showing people how to use a hammer, a tool they've never had, and people insist on preferring to whack a nail with a loaf of bread. And so here I am, I guess, disagreeing with Adam Savage a little bit. A loaf of bread is not a hammer, and it's not a particularly useful hammer. If you have a hammer available, it's preferable. Some things are better substitutes for a hammer, but there are no really good substitutes for USDI, and especially for a medical care inflation slice, which is where we're eventually going to be going with this thing. So we've been gaining a lot of fans to the USDI concept, a lot of fans. I mean, everybody seems to love the idea of being able to have a tuition indexed cryptocurrency. Figuring out how to get it into a 529 plan will be a problem for a different day. But we have to start with having an instrument, right? So we have a lot of fans, and we're developing use cases like this, and we're platforming this thing. But right now, what we need is for people to show that they care about the existence of hammers. Because if people don't go out and buy the first couple of hammers that somebody puts out there, then nobody makes more hammers because they don't think anybody really wants hammers. And at first, of course, no one knows how to use a hammer. And so it's a slow growth. It's always going to be slow growth, but you got to have somebody wanting to buy the hammer. So what I'm asking of you is this. Some of you will have crypto wallets. If you do, please, please, please head over to usdicoin.com. Obviously, there's a link in the show notes, and just mint some USDI. You'll have to have USDC in your wallet. There's only a tiny cost to do it, like $1 if you're minting a small amount. But that becomes a vanishingly small amount of money that it costs you if you mint a lot. If you mint $1,000, it's just a fraction of that. If you mint $1, then you'll pay $2 for the $1. So $1 is the lowest cost, but it's very, very cheap. So please just mint. Go there, mint $100, $500, $1,000, whatever you please. You can burn it at any time, but in the meantime, you're going to earn the rise in the price level over time in a way that you would if you had an inflation-linked savings account, but they don't exist. And so this is your inflation-linked savings account. Now, if you do not have a crypto wallet, and that's still most of us, right? Then what I want you to do is I want you to hit up your network on X or on Facebook or on Instagram or on Snapchat or on Tinder or wherever, okay, wherever you have your network, and ask your network as a favor. Say, anyone who does have a crypto wallet, there's this podcast, and this podcaster I really like, and I'm trying to help them. And so can you go to usdicoin.com and mint some of this USDI? And you can go do it there, or you can go to like Uniswap and swap whatever other coins you have on Ethereum mainnet for USDI. We want to make sure everyone eventually has the hammer. But first, we have to show that people want hammers. Otherwise, we're all going to be stuck hammering nails with baguettes, and nobody wants that, do they? And that's all for today's podcast. Please like, subscribe, refer others, send people to usdicoin.com. You can contact me at inflationguy@enduringinvestments.com. Thanks to all of you who have done so. You can subscribe for free to the blog at inflationguy.blog or follow me on X at inflation_guy. Visit Enduring Investments if you need help with diagnosing and treating an inflation problem, and most importantly, defend your money. And if inflation is coming for you, remember, you know about it.